Hello humans, Mr. Bell here with part 2 of our video series of making flat objects into three-dimensional objects. You can see that I've already worked on half of mine, and I'll show you what I'm going to do with that here in a second, but for now I want to focus on the other half. When you do this, I suggest that you do it in half. Remember, starting with that fattest piece in the middle, thinking about using a very simple object, maybe thinking along the lines of round or square, and thinking about how this doesn't have to look exactly like the object that you are making, but it has to be like a facsimile, but it has to be a pretty good example of something that looks with that basic shape, remembering that I am working on an apple. So this is that basic shape for it. And then we can go add some details later. What I've already done is I've ripped off some chunks of the cardboard and kind of separated it. So I'm using like these flat sheets of paper that are separate. I don't really want this corrugated part because it doesn't stick as well. So I'm really trying to separate that middle part and only work in the realm of like this paper that is on the outside, like this. So those are pretty good chunks right there. I'm gonna find a little bit more. So the way that I do this is pretty simple. You just really, what you need to do is first kind of rip off a chunk of cardboard so it's a little smaller. And then kind of layer by layer, try to gently rip off the paper that's on the outside. It's gonna be glued to the corrugated parts on the inside, and that's okay. And again, it can be kind of frustrating to rip off, but you want to try to get as big a sheets as you can when you rip this off. So be real gentle, kind of think about going slow and steady. You want strips. If they're big chunks, that's okay, but really what you want them to be is long, so you have enough to kind of wrap it around the object that you're making. I'm going to rip off just a few more sheets. You don't really need that much, and this technique actually produces things that are surprisingly strong when you do this. Let me rip off just a little bit more, and then I think I'm going to get to it. Again, the only materials you really need for this is your piece of cardboard, the outlines and the structure that you've already hopefully cut out, and a cup of water, which you can see. Mine is double layered, so I have that middle layer of cardboard too, which I do want to use. Kind of getting in there. Remember thinking about cutting these or ripping these in sheets. They don't have to be like even. You can use little chunks, you can use big chunks, but you want them to be able to kind of be long enough to wrap around. That's a good one right there. I think this will probably be a pretty good amount. Again, I've already begun half of mine. This is still wet. As it dries, it'll definitely shrink a little bit, and these wrinkles will kind of disappear. We're going to cover those up as we go too. So ultimately, this will look pretty smooth. This is going to attach here, kind of around that area, and it'll start to become rounder and rounder. I already kind of stuck these together, so you can see they're not really glued together. They're just a little bit of paper or a little water in it. So you dip your finger in your cup, get it wet, bam, stick together. Paper, naturally, once you get it wet, it wants to stick to more paper. That's how paper is made, essentially. You just pulp up the paper fibers and stick them together. And this works basically the same way. Again, this is going to ultimately be part of this, and I'm going to skin this, and it'll start to look a lot more round. Leaving this to the side, though, because I don't really want to work with it now. So you take your cardboard chunk, and you give it a decent soak. You don't want it to be saturated. You don't want it to the point where it's about to fall apart. But you want it pretty well soaked through and wet. And then just like you do with, like if you're using paper mache, this works basically the same. You start sticking it together. At first, it's going to be super fragile. As it starts to dry, it will become a lot more secure. You see how I'm kind of smoothing that into it? You want the water that you're soaking in these skins to kind of soak into the cardboard structure itself. But you don't really want to get your cardboard very wet at first. This big old chunk. Dipping it, getting it pretty wet, not to the point where it starts to fall apart, but so it is pretty well saturated. Then you want it to wrap around what you've already cut out. So I'm kind of purposely folding it. So it kind of, well, instead of being flat now, it's going to start to take the shape of the material underneath it, which happens to be more cardboard in my case. Again, I am going to use some plastic in this. And you can't really stick like plastic together with water, but there is other ways to do it without having to use glue. If you do have some Elmer's glue or something, you might want to glue these together. That's totally fine. I'm just doing this for those of us who do not have glue, kind of proving that this is totally possible to do with very minimal amount of material. So I'm giving this guy a good soak. Again, I want that water to get onto the cardboard below it, but I don't want it to be like super soaked. Again, wrapping it around, pushing in those wrinkles. As it dries, those wrinkles will solidify and they'll become really strong. Take this guy, dip it up. Soaking it in, giving it kind of a little bit of a pinch to kind of force that water into the cardboard below it. Kind of make those fibers merge. I'm like literally kind of like smoothing it out, almost like you would with clay. And again, this is kind of pushing those fibers together, kind of forcing this into the realm of behaving more like if you're a person that kind of understands how to use ceramics. This is actually kind of a similar technique. Squishing it in together, trying to smooth those fibers out. Bam, that's looking pretty good. Then ultimately, I'm going to put it on like this. And I know this doesn't look very good right now, but trust me when I say this is just kind of the beginning of how to do this. We're going to ultimately kind of smooth this out and kind of add some more shape to it. So it'll be really exactly that shape that I'm really looking for. I'm going to put this guy here, like so. Then I am going to start pushing these guys together. So these are already pretty wet, so they want to take this form. Give them a little squish, but see, it is, you know, to the point where it kind of wants to stay there. Just a little bit more cardboard and it'll get to that point. So now I'm going to start using this sheet that I have that's the corrugated part, that's the wavy part. It's going to work just the same. Getting it pretty wet. Working those fibers. And I'm going to start to squish these two sides together. Again, smoothing it out. Kind of getting those wrinkles to be where we want them to be. Forcing this two-dimensional flat cardboard into behaving like it is a three-dimensional thing. We're probably to the point where it's going to want to stick together. No, not quite yet. I got to get one on the bottom. Rip off another piece of skin. You know, there's no rush as we dry. As it dries, it's just going to get stronger. So maybe pausing in the middle of while you're doing this is not necessarily a bad thing. Because especially at first, it can be kind of frustrating to get these things to stick together. That is why, to begin with, especially with the limited tools that I'm using for this, I'm really working on something a lot simpler than normally I would make. My inclination when I do stuff like this is to maybe make an animal or something like that. But really, again, hard push into that realm of thinking about making things simple. Be kind to yourself. Don't get super ambitious with this because it can be kind of difficult to do. Using my scissors to kind of separate that skin. Remember, I'm looking for that thick cardboard in the middle part, not so much the outside skin, but the skin on the middle. Just squish it out, kind of flatten it. And then this is going to be a really good binding piece. And it's a little bit thicker, so it's going to add a little bit thicker of a layer of skin, and it will be a little stronger too. Giving it a real good soak because it's a thicker part. I'll put this guy right here. Really push those wrinkles in, using them as like a structural element. Pushing that in. And now I kind of have, like, the water at this point has kind of really soaked into those layers on the inside. So now all of a sudden this becomes kind of more malleable. Malleable means that I can push it in and I can really kind of start almost working this cardboard like it's clay. You don't want to use nearly as much pressure because it is quite fragile. But it will kind of manipulate under your hands now. As you're doing this, you'll start to realize that the middle part is getting pretty soaked, and it can be manipulated just like the outside. So I'm thinking this is looking pretty decent. Maybe give it a little squish there. And again, this is about the challenge of using only these really limited supplies that we have. I will be getting kits to you guys very soon. We don't have the go-ahead to do that quite yet. When we do, though, I'm going to get you some stuff. We're going to be working with some more materials that are a little bit more strong and probably a little less frustrating to work with. But, you know, quarantine is quarantine, and we haven't had a chance to do that yet. But I like this activity because it really does prove that you don't need fancy art supplies to make something that ends up looking, you know, pretty good. Probably would look better if we were using fancier materials. But cardboard really is the sculptor's friend. So I have my basic apple shape. And again, we're going to flesh this out and it's going to start to look a lot more realistic. But I am going to end this part of it. So because once you get this far, I want you to give it a good like 24 hours to really fully dry. So we can start adding those finer details to it. And I know that this kind of just looks like it's a ball of cardboard right now. But it really will start to get fleshed out and look a lot better. Again, think about a very simple object to do this with.